It's always exciting here at Alhambra Investments. Today is no exception. And so let's go see what Steve Brennan's got. Steve?
Joe had made an interesting comment recently that he was finding the conference board's leading economic indicators were no longer working. I kind of want to follow up with that, Joe, because that's a pretty big statement. And also, I'm kind of interested in what you think might be triggering that. I mean, COVID was a pretty unusual event. I think you made a reference to us maybe not being so much a manufacturing economy anymore. And certainly, there's long been talk about becoming more of a service economy, but we've also seen a move towards fracking, energy exporting, and the energy sector being a much bigger part of the economy. We've seen a move from, we've talked about this, maybe we're going back a little bit to the 70s and being more of a inflation-driven cycles. There's a lot potentially going on here that could maybe explain why the leading economic indicators aren't working. But I was just hoping that, big topic, but could you maybe go into it a little bit of what's exactly going on here? And well, just explain everything and give me a definitive answer, please.
Yeah, because I can tell you exactly what's going on. Well, I think it's interesting or it's useful to think about where the LEI comes from, where the leading economic indicators come from. And they did come out of a project back in, I think it was the 1940s, and I don't remember the guy's name. He was a government guy that I don't remember exactly where he was, maybe the Commerce Department, I don't really remember. But the point was to come up with this idea of these leading economic indicators. They were developed for the government and maybe for the Fed and so forth. But it was the 1940s, 1950s, 60s, all that time, we were a much more manufacturing-based economy. And so a lot of these indicators that they use to come up with these leading economic indicators are this composite that tells you, hey, we're in recession or headed for recession or whatever. They were developed at a time when manufacturing was a much bigger part of the economy and services were a much smaller part. But I think too that there's also some unique things going on right now. And I think what the LEI has really told us is that manufacturing has been in a recession for 2 years. And by the way, it's also telling us right now that it's coming out of it, which is really, really interesting to me because that's something we've talked about. In a lot of ways, the LEI confirms what we've been saying, which is that the goods side of the economy, which is really in manufacturing as much as anything else, but it's really goods based because it also we also saw that in imports and so forth, which are now starting to rise again at a pretty good rate. So that goods side of the economy is starting to recover, and we think that I guess I shouldn't use that royal we. It's me. I think that as you start to get rates down, which we're obviously going to see some move in rates tomorrow, probably. You see more housing activity. You're going to see more goods activity as well. And that's going to show up in manufacturing. We're starting to see that in wholesale inventories rising, even with total business inventory to sales ratio is falling. But the point is that it is manufacturing based leading economic indicators. And by the way, another interesting little tidbit is that the guy who developed that ultimately was the guy who started another company. Now see, I've said it. Now I can't think of the name of the company. It's a very prominent company that forecasts recession. Same guy came up with the same thing. The point is that this information is not just used by the conference board; it's used by others. Now, when you see it in other contexts, in the conference board, the number of indicators is really not that great. There's not a whole bunch of these things, but they are what they are. And I'm just going to look at some of them. If you look at them right now, the latest instance you had, you look at the components. There are financial components. You have something called the leading credit index, which is a conference board index, the S&P 500, and you have interest rate spread, which they use term spread. We're talking about the yield curve. They use the 10-year Treasury note yield minus the Fed funds rate. Well, the first two of those are positive. The leading credit index and the S&P 500 are positive numbers. They add a positive to this leading economic index. The interest rate spread, the term spread, is negative, and it actually just about wipes out everything that's positive from the other two. And I think that's interesting because we don't, I've said this many, many times. The yield curve to me is an indication of things, and more than anything, it's an indication of Fed policy. I don't know that it really has any causative effect on the economy. But anyway, then you look at the other things, the non-financial components. You have average consumer expectations for business conditions. That comes out of their survey. And we've talked about this many times. These surveys, particularly of consumers, are heavily biased because of politics these days. And so I don't really pay any attention to them. I don't pay attention to the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index. I just don't think they're very useful because they've been skewed by politics so much. Anyway, that's the second most negative piece in the non-financial components. The next most significantly negative thing is the ISM index of new orders, and that is ISM manufacturing index of new orders. Yes, it is negative right now. It's below 50, but it's also at a level that is not associated with recession, which the ISM will tell you. But it is a negative, and I'll grant you that. But it is off the lows too. It's coming back up. We'll see where it goes. But my point is that it's manufacturing based. Building permits, that's very, very interest rate sensitive, is a slight negative. Average weekly hours worked in manufacturing is a positive, by the way. Manufacturers' new orders for non-defense capital goods ex aircraft, that is capital goods orders, that's a neutral. New orders for consumer goods and materials is a positive. And average weekly initial claims of unemployment insurance is a negative. And it's interesting that it's negative because it's near an all-time low. How can it be negative? Well, it's negative because it's up from the all-time low. But if you look at today's unemployment claims, by the way, if you adjust them for population and you compared it to a number from the 1960s, it would have to be under 100,000. That's where we would be right now. Instead, it's 230,000. It's a number that's very, very low. Yes, it's off the low, so it's moving in the wrong direction. They count it as a negative. The point is that a lot of those things are manufacturing based. It doesn't really tell you all that much about the whole economy. It tells you about the manufacturing economy. And they also use the LEI as an indication. If you look at the year-over-year change, actually they look at the 6-month growth rate and the LEI, and what you get is if it's a -5%, if it's going down, you hit a -5%, then it says you're headed for recession. You've signaled a recession. Well, by the way, that happened at the end of 2022, and we were under that -5% until 4 months ago. And 4 months ago, it got back above -5%, and now it's not signaling recession. That's what I was talking about when I say we've had a manufacturing goods recession for the last 2 years. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And we have. And we're starting to see it end. We got more evidence of it this morning. Industrial production up 0.8%, which was 4 times the estimate. Manufacturing output there was up 0.9. We're seeing a rise now in wholesale inventories, even though the inventory to sales ratios are not rising, meaning that they've raised some inventory, but the sales are rising too. So, everything right now that I see in I won't say everything, but a lot of things that I see right now are pointing towards a recovery in this manufacturing economy, including the LEI. So I think it's a great indicator of how things are going in the good part of the economy. I'm not sure it's all that great at telling you when you're going to have recession. Recessions generally are driven by investment. And that's why they've got that housing piece in there. They've got a piece that is one of the indicators is, building permits. And housing activity and investment, residential investment, is oftentimes a leader going into recession. It tends to turn down first. And that's because the Fed raises rates, by the way, which we've already done that. And again, I think that if you see interest rates come down, the housing economy is going to turn around. And frankly, we may be seeing it already. We don't have any numbers from August yet after mortgage rates really fell. But as we discussed yesterday, if you look at a 15-year mortgage, you've got rates really down around 5%. That's not a very high number. Now, look, a lot of people don't do 15-year mortgages, but the standard is 30 years, and that number is still up around 6.25. But that number will come down, I think, as interest rates come down and as the spread between that and the 10-year closes. And if you get those numbers coming down, you're going to see increased housing activity. And by the way, we got a National Association of Home Builders this morning. Their sentiment index rose. It's still low. It's 41. It came up from 39 to 41. Anything under 50 is considered, not so good. And so it's got a long way to go to get to the good side. But we got, it's moving in the right direction finally. So look, the LEI is useful. It's just not necessarily a great indicator of recession. So use it for what it's good for. That's what I do. Let's take a look at the components and say, well, what is this telling me? And that's what we do. And that's, I think, different than you're going to see from most people. Most people are going to look at this and say the LEI is negative. Oh my God, we're going to have a recession. Well, you got to think a little bit. And by the way, this whole thing about the goods recession, this is COVID related. This is, we talked about this when it was happening. We talked about it since it happened. And what happened was you had everybody shut in their house, and they had money because we had a lot of COVID relief, whatever you want to call it. So everybody had money, everybody had a job, everybody had income, or not everybody, but most people, and they couldn't go and do anything. They couldn't go out to dinner. They couldn't go out to lunch. They couldn't go on a trip. They were stuck in their house. And what did they do? They spent on their house. They bought a hot tub. They did anything they could do to upgrade the experience of being stuck at home. And so they spent a lot on goods. Once the economy opened back up, that changed. And you started to see people do things like take trips and go to dinner and all these other things, go to the movies even, things like that. That's a service part of the economy. It's picked up tremendously, and the good side fell off. And I suspect, by the way, you're going to see another little cycle like that. And I think it takes time for this stuff to settle out. So you had this big spike in goods, it comes down, services spikes. It'll take a while for it to get back in sync. So don't be surprised if we start to see the manufacturing side of the economy get better and the service side get worse. And then you'll hear from all the negative people out there say, oh my God, the services side getting worse. Now we're headed for recession. We may or may not. Services is a bigger part of the economy. So maybe it will be that time. But I wouldn't be surprised to see it continue to oscillate like that until it finally gets back in sync. I don't know when that'll be.
Lots of information to go through. So if you've got questions for Joe, be sure to put them in the comment section down below.